Our scripture this morning comes from 1 Kings in the 17th chapter, and we'll begin reading in the 8th verse. Well, let's just begin in the 7th verse. I don't think I have it on the screen, but we'll begin in verse 7. Sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. And then the word of the Lord came to him being Elijah, "Go at once to Zarephath of Sidon and stay there. I have commanded a widow in that place to supply you with food." So he went to Zarephath, and when he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink?" And as she was going to get it, he called, "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she replied, "I don't have any bread. Only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you've said. But first make a small cake of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. And then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord gives rain on the land." And so she went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. This is the word of the Lord for us today. At the end of your rope, there seems to be no hope. You look at the circumstances around you and you see no way out. Whether you find yourself with more months at the end of the money, or you're needing provisions to make it through just one more day, you've received a scary diagnosis that you don't know how in the world you're going to deal with, or you find yourself seemingly all alone going through the worst possible day of your life. There are all too many people in this planet, and probably not too many in this world, that have not had these feelings of hopelessness run through their veins at some time or another. So, what do you do when you find yourself in that situation? In desperation, you cry out to God. Oh, if there even is a God in heaven. With one last plea to Him, if He's even real, if He's even listening, if He even cares, over and over again, you beg, "I'll do anything if you'll just hear my plea, if you'll answer my prayer, if God you will provide for me, if you will heal me, if you will take away the pain, Lord, would you just hear me?" We meet this morning a widow who finds herself in a similar situation. Unfortunately, we don't catch her name in this story, but we may as well fill in our own name in place of hers. And I just would ask that you do that this morning as we go through this story. Put yourself in her shoes today. Now, if we were to have read the beginning of chapter 17 here in 1 Kings, we would have learned that Elijah, the prophet of God, had told Ahab, king of Israel, that it's not going to rain for the next few years. You won't even find a drop of dew on the ground until I, Elijah, prophet of God, say it's going to rain again. And then God took Elijah and hid him away for a while, because you don't deliver news like that to a king and expect to live. God took Elijah and hid him away. Isaac, I think I've got a little map. Let's see if this works. Hey, look at that. Can you see my little dot? He hid him away by this little brook over here. This ravine of Kerith. That's where he hid him away. But the problem was, see, what happens when it doesn't rain for a while? Little brooks dry up, don't they? And that's what happened in this brook that Elijah was staying at. But you see, this is all taking place down here in Israel, where Elijah was prophesying. He's prophesying down here in Samaria. That's where Ahab was reigning. And that's where this drought was taking place. But you see, droughts don't just affect one little city or one little place. It spreads throughout entire regions. And so it was in this case. Now this widow, she lived all the way up here in Zarephath. For those of you in the choir, it's at the top of this TV screen, okay? Up here, this Zarephath, in the land of Sidon. It says Phoenicia. And it's a whole different country up above Israel. And this drought begins to affect them too. And who do you think that a major drought would affect first? Well, it's going to affect the poor and the widows and the elderly. And that's where if we put ourselves in the shoes of this little widow woman, that's where we find ourselves today. She finds herself now with no husband to help provide for her needs, the needs of herself and her small child. How do we know he's a small child? Well, if you've got a chore of picking up sticks, who are you going to send to do that? Yourself or your kids? I'm sending my kids. Kids love to pick up sticks, don't they? Don't you? No? Maybe they're too big to pick up sticks, but Bentley would love to pick up sticks, wouldn't he? But it says that she was out picking up sticks. Now, why is she out doing that herself unless her son, her child, was too small to go out and do that chore for her? But here's the other aspect of this story that we don't want to miss. You see, I told you we find ourselves no longer in the land of Israel. We're here in the land of Phoenicia or Sidon, it says. Have you ever heard of old Jezebel? You heard that name before, right? She's the wife of King Ahab. Well, this is the land that she came from. She is the daughter of the king of this land, the king of Sidon, the region of Zarephath, the land of Phoenicia. And this whole area up here was known for their devotion to and worship to the false god of Baal. And so with the marriage of Jezebel to King Ahab came with it the worship of Baal in Egypt. Now they were already worshiping Baal in Israel. They were already worshiping Baal in Israel somewhat, but Ahab began to build idols and temples to Baal as well. And he did that in the capital city of Samaria when he married Jezebel to please her, his wife. You see, Baal was known as the god of rain and the fertility of the land, the crops, and so forth. And yet here we are, we find ourselves in the midst of the land of this widow. She's in the land of the god of the crops and the rain, and yet we have neither. So perhaps this widow, I can just picture in my mind, she's beginning to think, just maybe Baal, if he can't provide rain to give us crops to eat, then maybe He's no God at all. But she's begun to hear, or she has heard rumblings, she's heard rumors of this God of the land south of her, this God of the land of Israel. And she's heard how their God had delivered them from certain death when they were slaves in the land of Egypt. But God delivered them out of that land only to be trapped between an army and a sea. Certain death, right? But no, God sent a wind to drive back the water all night long so that they were able to walk across that sea on dry land. God delivered them. She heard that story. Perhaps she heard how when it was time to take possession of a new land, and they came upon the first city, the mighty city of Jericho, they were able to take that city without lifting one finger. That as the people trusted God and did what God asked them to do, even something as silly as marching around the city for 7 days in a row without saying a word, and then on the 7th day letting out this loud shout. Perhaps she heard how that God fought for them and gave them victory after victory as they took possession of this land that they now live in. And I can just picture this widow in the midst of this horrific drought that's now ravishing her land, so much so that she's even running dry on her flour and her oil. I can just picture these things going through her mind. The God I've been brought up with, that's supposed to be providing all this rain and providing all the crops, He's proving to be no God at all. But the God that I've heard of in the land of Israel, He's proven to be a deliverer. Over and over again, He has saved His people. The God of the land of Israel seems to be a living God who cares for His people. And so I can just picture this widow woman as she begins to cry out to God in her time of desperation. Not the false God who's proven to be nothing at all, but the God of all hope. And I can just hear her as she prays. Can't you? God of the land of Israel. I'm not real sure how this is done. I'm not sure if you can even hear me because I'm a woman in a foreign land to you. But God, I've heard some great and mighty things about you. And God, if they're true, that makes you a mighty awesome God who cares for your people. And I know I don't belong to you, or at least I'm not part of your people, but I need someone to care for me right now. God, I've already lost my husband, and if we don't find something to eat real fast, I'm fixing to lose my son next. God, my flour, it's running out. The oil's about to dry up. My boy, he's small and he's fragile. God, I've heard of your miracles, and I could sure use one of them right now, if they're even possible. And can't you just see each day as her supplies are dwindling to less and less, that she prays this prayer over and over again as in desperation she turns to the only source of hope that she knows is possibly left in her life. Now here's the interesting thing. This whole time you have Elijah who's experiencing a similar trial and crisis of faith. He's had to place his whole faith and trust in God, as he's had to deliver this message of certain death to the king of Israel. And God's hid him away in this ravine and said, I'm gonna take care of you there and give you water. And he's been fed by ravens. The ravens have been bringing him meat and bread every morning and every evening. But the brook eventually dries up because there's no rain in the land. There's no rain in the land because God had Elijah to prophesy to Ahab, and God had Elijah to prophesy to Ahab to show him that God, the one and only true God of Israel, is the only true source of provision, that there's these other false gods whom Ahab had introduced to their worship. There are no gods at all. So when the brook dries up, God says to Elijah, "Don't worry, son. You go on up to Zarephath. For I've commanded a widow there to supply you with food." Okay, God. I've seen you feed me so far, and now you're telling me to go to the land of the enemy, the land I've been prophesying against, and you want me to stay with a what? A widow woman? Maybe this is a widow that's had a rich husband. Maybe that's where I'm to go. Well, this ought to be interesting. But you see, Elijah trusted God, and he did what he was told to do. And that's a pretty good trek from Israel up to Zarephath. But he makes it. Now, I know that it says here that God commanded this widow to feed Elijah, but it sure seems like reading this that she hadn't been clued in on what's taken place, has she? So what I think may be at play here is the word commanded could also be meant to be taken to be as appointed or provided. I have provided a widow to feed you. I've appointed a person to feed you when you get there. Just as God provided those ravens to take care of him back in verse 4. Although, have you ever had those times in your life when you've prayed and prayed and prayed and begging God to answer your prayer, and you feel like you finally get an answer, and it's something like, "God, I desperately need food for me and my son." And God answers with, "Yes, I know you need, and I'm going to provide. And so I'm sending you another mouth to feed." And God, maybe God, you didn't hear me right. I said, "God, we're running out of food, and I can't feed myself." And He said, "Yeah, I know, so here's another man I want you to feed." God, you're crazy. God, I'm staring at the bottom of my jar here. I got nothing left. There's barely any oil left. And He said, "Yes, my child. I want you to take on this man. And I'll provide for your needs." How can this be? How can this be? And here is Elijah. And can you imagine what he's thinking as God sends him to this woman? "God, you said you'd provide for me, but you've sent me to a woman that's got nothing. She's got nothing. How is this going to work?" Two people, both in need, and yet God provides for them both by answering both of their prayers individually, yet He pairs them up together with just a little flour, just a little oil. And so just imagine the calm that must have come over as Elijah speaks to her. The voice of God speaks these words through Elijah's mouth. And these words that we all need to hear probably every single day of our lives. As he says there in verse 13, "Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid." I can only imagine how some folks must feel each and every day as they wake up every morning. Afraid. I was listening to the television, I think the morning I was working on this sermon, I was watching TV, and Chris Carter, do you know who that is? He was a receiver for the Vikings for many years. And I know you're shaking your head at me, but this It makes sense, okay? Chris Carter was on there talking about how he's 20 years sober and alcoholic. And yet he wakes up still every morning afraid. Afraid. Afraid that I'm going to mess up today. That I'm going to slip and fall back into my old habits today. Afraid that I'm not going to make it through today. And he's got to lean on all the people around him. And he went on, and it was a powerful little interview that he had there. But it just struck me and it grabbed me when he said, I wake up every morning afraid. How many people go through life afraid? Afraid every day, afraid of what is behind them, afraid of what's in their present, afraid of what is ahead, afraid of all of those people around them, afraid of being all alone, afraid of not having enough, or afraid of not doing enough, or afraid of not being able to provide enough for your family, or afraid of not saying the right thing, or afraid of not being able to love your family enough. How many people wake up and are staring at the bottom of the jar, afraid, not knowing what lies ahead? And yet God speaks these words, don't be afraid. I've heard it said that God speaks some form of don't be afraid in His Word some 365 times in the Bible. That's once for every day. Now, I don't know if that's accurate count or not. I've not taken the time to look up all the verses and count them. So we might not want to quote that. But what we do know is that God does speak it over and over and over again. Do not fear, don't be afraid. Urging us to trust in Him, to depend upon Him, to believe that He will take care of us even when it seems that all hope is gone. That's what Elijah has to do here. That's what this widow has to do here. Trust that God will provide. And so he says, go on home and make your meal for you and your son, but first, make a little bit for me. For this is what God promises. That little bit of flour and that little bit of oil, they'll not run dry. They'll not run dry until God sends rain upon the land. Do you know that drought lasted for 3 years? 3 years it didn't rain upon the land. And that little bit of flour and that little bit of oil lasted them. Could you imagine waking up every morning, looking in your cupboard, saying, God, I'm going to trust you today, that this is going to get us through another day. I don't know. But God, I got to place my trust in you because it's all I got. You know it wouldn't. You know He didn't just multiply it into a whole storehouse full for 3 more years so that they could see the promise. You know it just left so that they're looking at the bottom of the jar. So that they're having to say, God, I trust you. I'm dependent upon you. Every day, would you make it last? Enough for me, enough for my son, enough for this man that you've sent me. And I don't know why he's here, but you've paired us together. And he's been a blessing, if I'm going to be honest, because you've answered my prayer through him. God has made a way. This widow has to actively have the faith and actively trust that God is actively answering her prayer here and now in the form of this man. God promises us that His grace is sufficient. Even when it seems all hope is lost, His grace is sufficient. For His power is made perfect in our weakness. When all hope seems lost, when we're staring headlong into the impossible, God has a knack of showing up and showing out. Now, there may be some of you here today that are staring right smack dab at the bottom of the jar. And I don't know your situations, but I know you've been crying out to God, begging for Him to hear your pleas, to hear your cries for mercy. Whether it's for healing or for hope, for some form of help, just to be loved, just to know someone cares. The Lord is saying to you today, don't be afraid, my child. Don't be afraid. My grace is sufficient for you. Jesus beckoned us, come unto me, all ye who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Come unto the Lord today. Lay your burdens at His feet. Trust in His provision for your life today. I'd ask you to do that as we sing our closing hymn. As you're staring at the bottom of your jar, trust that He will make a way as we